It's the Matt Sager Podcast, Monday, November 5th. How was your weekend? Mine was adequate, fine, uneventful. Bookended by rain, both Friday and tonight, Monday, were sort of gross, rainy nights here in New York City. But at least Saturday and Sunday were really, really beautiful. Just didn't have a ton of stuff going on. It was sort of the post-Halloween come down, and a good friend of mine who'd been in town left, and I didn't really make backup plans, and so just basically caught up on some stuff for this week's Matt Sager Podcast, which, certainly is fun and will benefit all of us as the week goes by. Got a ton of stuff to talk about, not all of which I'm really going to be able to address tonight. Just simply too many issues. And I've got to form an opinion on some of these things still. Some of these things are very complicated. In particular, I've received lots and lots of requests to discuss this Netflix memo that's been reported in the Wall Street Journal and other places that makes it sound like a pretty dystopian workplace. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. And that's going to be an entire episode of this podcast later in the week. Second only to that in terms of requests has been my take on Bohemian Rhapsody, the Freddie Mercury Queen biopic that debuted on Friday. And the short answer is, it's an amazing movie. It's not a perfect movie. It is flawed, as are all biopics, music biopics, sometimes especially so. Rami Malek was nothing short of incredible as Freddie Mercury. He embodied him. He became him. It was eerie and just amazing. And as friends of mine on Facebook have been saying today, it will be a crime if he's not nominated for Best Actor at next Academy Awards. You'd have to be either a snob, someone utterly disinterested in the music, and even then, simply the quality of this movie, which apparently suffered through a lot of disharmony and acrimony behind the scenes, you would not know it from the production. Yes, there are a few falsehoods, a few errors perhaps, nothing that seemed designed to make any parties look especially good or bad. The only thing that really jumped out at me was there's a scene in which they confront their manager that, depending on your point of view, is either neatly packaging several characters who don't really matter that much into this one fictional character, or the scene itself is pure fiction. And considering it's an entire scene of the movie, it is a bit odd, but anyone with a knowledge of comedy films of the last 20 years, anyone who's seen Wayne's World will understand why this scene was written in. It is a nod and a wink and a sort of Easter egg callback to the history of Bohemian Rhapsody, the song, and its use in movies prior to now. And it's pretty much the most egregious falsehood that I, as not a music encyclopedia, but I have been a music journalist. I was a music editor. I've been published in Rolling Stone. I kind of know my stuff. When I was on music radio here in New York, I had to learn a lot of facts, basically memorize, in the same way a law student needs to memorize all these legal precedents so that they can argue them when they make their cases in court, when they become lawyers. I had to have stuff ready to talk about out of every song. And the times were not as crazy as they are now, so I couldn't say, hey, how about Trump, that insane thing he said this morning? I had to have stuff relevant to the music, so I know an awful lot about, for instance, Queen. Not as much as some of my colleagues in music, but I can stand on the same stage as them, and we could compete in trivia contests together. And in fact, that's a great idea for an episode of this podcast. Get in touch with me if you want to play Freddie Mercury trivia. I'll bet I can beat you. Speaking of Rami Malek, he was a big feature of Bojack Horseman Season 5, which was just stunning, beautiful, and ended in the most sad yet potentially redemptive way that the series has done so far. The fact that they've been managing to keep this up for 5 seasons and still getting better and better is incredibly impressive. Much more fun and deep and serious and silly all at once than any one show has a right to be. It's just an incredibly perfect piece of television. And it has been renewed for a season 6, which may or may not end up featuring Rami Malek returning. Not just because he's a super rock star movie star now, which he is. I think he takes the job he wants, and I think he wanted to work on Bojack, and I think he probably would do it again if asked. But without giving anything away, it's not totally clear that his character would necessarily be around to return. That's all. I hope so, though, because he was a spectacular addition to an already stellar voice cast fronted by Will Arnett, Aaron Paul, Amy Sedaris, Paul F. Tompkins, and many more. Alison Brie, Alan Arkin did a season, Patton Oswalt stops by occasionally. It's just the best show. And so I'm very excited that it's been renewed. It took longer than usual for Netflix to announce that it's been renewed. They only made the announcement on October 30th. I only found out today. And that is unusual for Netflix and Bojack. And so I was nervous because, Netflix has been on this cancellation spree. They canceled American Vandal and then Iron Fist, which I actually understand completely. Then Luke Cage, which made less sense. And it seemed like they were just going, oh boy, the streaming wars are getting ready to heat up. Disney's going to launch their streaming service soon. DC Universe has already launched. Like, the landscape is going to be more cluttered. And Netflix has to sort of tighten their purse strings. I understand that. But to sacrifice Bojack would have been awful. And after season 1 ended, I think they made the announcement within something like 2 weeks that season 2 was officially going to happen. And after season 2, that was such a success that I think like the same day or the next day. And that's sort of been par for the course with Bojack. You tend to pretty much instantly find out that it's been renewed. So this 6-week wait has been very stressful for me in terms of my favorite show, not in terms of my life. I love and relate to Bojack and the show way too much, more than I honestly would like to, because in addition to being funny, it's actually quite sad. And speaking of sad, again, I'm doing my best to go in order of questions I've been asked the last few days. So speaking of sad, there was an episode of this podcast early on, I think it was episode 5, where I was recovering from a nasty cold, one that had kept me bedridden for several days. And during that time, I'd sort of watched and rewatched everything I'd ever enjoyed, watched a ton of new movies, and then fell down this sort of rabbit hole on YouTube and discovered the world of Opie and Anthony and the current state of all the people involved in that show, and found myself fascinated by Opie, who began podcasting on Westwood One, which, full disclosure, is something I discussed with them before he signed with them. And the person I was going to do the show with, I never felt that together we sounded professional enough that we ought to move forward with it. I said, listen, just guys screaming into a microphone apropos of nothing, people being noisy. Like, I get it, it's podcasting. We're free from the restrictions of radio, but we're still broadcast professionals and should be presented as such. And we just couldn't make it work. And then Opie got this show, and I thought, oh, they don't care about structure. They don't care about professionalism. It's Opie and 7 guys screaming into a $99 handheld recorder at a bar. That was what the first 30 or 40 episodes of the Opie Radio podcast are. It's the state the podcast was in when I did that first episode. I then revisited the show several weeks later when he'd gotten a studio and had started doing interviews with real guests, and thought it was still pretty terrible. But since then, I've been receiving lots and lots of emails, DMs, messages across various social networks saying, hey, why aren't you shitting on Opie more? And I just wasn't going to address it, but I'll answer it. I've had several moments where I've listened to him and thought, oh God, he's still at it. My God. But number one is that I'm not a super fan or even a fan. I don't have any vested interest in, oh, Opie said this, so Anthony should say that, and then Jimmy should do this. I really don't care. Not because I don't think they're talented. I think they are. I certainly think Anthony Cumia and Jim Norton are incredibly funny. I'm troubled by a lot of other stuff about Anthony Cumia. But again, my knowledge is fairly limited. When they were on New York radio, I was on New York radio too at a sister station, and the last thing I wanted to do before or after work was listen to anybody on the radio. Similarly, when they went to Sirius XM, well, they went to XM and I was at Sirius. Sirius is where I burned out on radio completely. And so the idea of me listening to anybody on Sirius or Sirius XM or XM, it was just not something that was on my agenda. It's not that I didn't think that there were talented people. It just not what I was in the mood for at all. But in this sort of fever-induced, like, I was really sick of watching flat earthers and other crazy people on YouTube. And so I was like, what's this whole Opie and Anthony thing about? And I found that his podcast was just really, really awful, as was his show after Anthony had been fired from SiriusXM. But as to why I haven't shat on him more, one, I really don't want to listen to his show, and I would need to do that and pull clips if I was going to do anything other than, hey, Opie sucks. And speaking of, hey, Opie sucks, I don't know Gregg Hughes. That's his real name. I do know what it's like to be abused by your fans. I know what it's like to discover people and bring them into your orbit and help get them jobs and have them shiv you like it's prison instead of radio. And you know who's never done that to me? Opie. So, entertainment aside, he's a human being. If you like his show, all power to you. I think anybody who enjoys the Opie Radio show should be listening and leaving him 5-star reviews and everything else. I just don't understand what the appeal is. And yes, there's a part of me that does kick myself, and this is not Opie's fault. Opie never knew about any of this. It is not germane to Opie that I thought doing a shitty podcast would not be an appropriate thing to do under any circumstances, and especially for Westwood One. And that he did feel okay just sort of doing anything. It just means I slept on an opportunity. And so my motivations for shitting on him, and another thing I discovered on YouTube is that shitting on Opie is basically a cottage industry. All of his former partners and coworkers rail against him on the Jim and Sam show. 9 times out of 10, you can tune in there, and if you listen long enough, they'll shit on him much more effectively and with much more knowledge of what he's really like than I ever could. Ditto the Anthony Cumia show. And then there's this whole industry of YouTubers who just go, here's Opie being stupid. Hey, you know what Opie did today that was so dumb? And they're pretty good at it, to be honest with you. Many of them amuse me. I just don't want to define myself by being anyone's enemy, and I don't want to make another radio guy's life unpleasant. I relate much too much. Now, having said that, tonight I will oblige. I will happily shit on Opie because he did something on YouTube, and I think he really would be better suited to just not make YouTube videos. They're all so cringy. There's one where he's at a gas station and he asks the guy, oh no, this is an episode of his podcast, I'm sorry. But there's an episode of his podcast where he's at a gas station buying like groceries and he's like, don't you know who I am? The guy's like, no. And he's like, I'm Opie Hughes. And the guy's like, great. Like he clearly thinks there's a mental patient in his gas station. And Opie goes, no. Google me. You'll see. I'm a big shot. The guy's like, okay, congratulations. Please take your ho-hos. This is very uncomfortable. And speaking of uncomfortable, he's not a great YouTuber. First of all, he continues to have this 90s shock jock voice where he goes, I love doing radio. I'm all about the radio. Been doing radio since I was 18. Which, by the way, I also have been doing radio since I was 18, which is another reason I've avoided shitting on him where possible. But I've done a little bit of growing up. I know you wouldn't necessarily know it to listen to me on this show, but Opie's got something like 12 years on me. I think he's in his mid-50s. He certainly looks like he's well into his 60s. He looks like the Revenant, or like an especially unhealthy version of Howard Hughes, dressed up like it's 1990 and he's a 20-year-old skater. It is very weird and uncomfortable, but not as uncomfortable as the pitch he makes to Joe Rogan. One that he'd apparently made in private, but one that he felt needed to be reiterated publicly, like he's going to shame Joe Rogan into being a guest on his podcast. It is very uncomfortable. I'll put a link in the description to this podcast because it is something to see. You got to watch him spinning around and pirouetting. He looks like at any second he could topple over because he's just doing a dance number while he does this weird monologue, kind of being passive-aggressive with Joe Rogan, who, first off, this is true of me too, obviously. But as a podcaster, Opie has no right speaking to Joe Rogan as if they're peers. Joe Rogan is a superstar. He helped develop and define the medium. He continues to do so to this day. Opie is just barely graduating to getting a studio. And his show is interrupted multiple times per episode with these bad production pieces where they go, so hey, I'm Joe, Opie's producer. You might notice that you don't hear the guest well. That's because Opie hired his pal to be his producer, and that guy's an idiot, and he didn't pot up the guy's mic, and nobody at Westwood One came in and said, hey, pot up your guest's mic. So please ignore the following 40 minutes of the show. It's like, you know what you could do instead of that? First of all, you could hire a producer. Second of all, Opie can run the board. I believe he did that as the host of Opie and Anthony. And third of all, if you've got unbearable audio and you need to introduce a production piece to explain and apologize for that, you know what's even better and more efficient than that? Cut out the shitty audio. But anyway, here's some audio of Opie sort of pleading with Joe Rogan, but in a way that doesn't, betray that he's begging. He's doing it as a guy to another guy. He's doing it as if they're peers. Like he used to do this with Howard Stern. Like, hey, I'm a guy who does radio. You're a guy who does radio. Yeah, you're not on the same level, and it's okay to admit that. It's a lot less cringy than this.
Yo, Joe Rogan, I got a question for you. Saw that you were coming to New York City for the UFC, and I got excited. Haven't seen you in a while, so I DM'd you. And I also texted you saying, hey, man, why don't you do the Opie Radio podcast? It'd be great. I also said, no pressure if you can't. Also said, congrats on the Netflix.
No pressure if you can't, but I'm going to shame you on YouTube like an asshole. Just, you need to watch and see what an a-hole he looks like as he makes this pitch. I am embarrassed for all parties, but I'll just play you a little more of his spiel.
Which was awesome.
Oh, wait. He's referencing Joe's recent Netflix special. Again, you are not talking to a peer, Greg. You are not going to appear on Netflix anytime soon. And also, you're not 18 anymore. Please stop using this 90s shock jock voice. It is unbecoming.
Also said, congrats on all the continued success. No pressure, but would love to have you on my podcast. And he never wrote me back.
Oh my God, he didn't?
Huh? What's that about?
Yeah, I mean, you're Opie.
I know damn well there was nothing I've done to you.
Yeah, you never pissed off Joe Rogan, so he should bend over backwards to be on your podcast. Of course, that's how the world works. So, yeah, again, I have no ambition to shit on Opie or to make shitting on Opie a regular feature on my podcast. There's another podcast that does that does a whole show about podcasts, but stops down and goes, all right, now that we've talked about that podcast, let's talk about how much Opie sucked this week. And they do an entire segment on it, and they do it very well. It's called Who Are These Podcasts? And it's a great show. But I have no desire to play in that field. It's just not where I want this show to go. But when Opie gets super cringy and you guys are asking me to comment on it, and then I stumble upon a video like that, then occasionally I'm going to have to chime in. Other stuff I'm going to need to address this week that many people have asked me about. Well, first off, there was this disaster with Diablo that happened at BlizzCon. And again, this is just a tease. I'm not covering this tonight. Also, this Netflix internal memo that was published, I believe, originally in the Wall Street Journal has since been republished all across the web. That makes it sound as though Netflix is a very dystopian place to work. But my feelings about that are complicated. At first, I'll be honest with you. As someone who has done work for Netflix, my first thought was, oh, I don't want to go there. I don't want to talk about it. My second thought was, no, you know what? I'm a podcaster. I've pledged to be as open and transparent as I can be, barring really personal stuff that's nobody's business. And if I'm going to be true to that, I will talk about this, and I will. But I also did some thinking about my resume, my history working in media, and how this memo does not read particularly flatteringly. It does make Netflix sound like a dystopic workplace. But I've worked in places with similar and worse memos and been very, very happy for years. I've worked for places that would never put something like that in writing, but where the work environment was toxic, where something like the conditions laid out in this Netflix memo would be a huge improvement. So I'll give you that spiel in the next couple of days. In the meantime, if you've got anything else you'd like me to talk about, get in touch with me. Email matt@mattsager.com or call 646-535-4788. You can also get me on social media. On Twitter, I'm @MattSager. On Instagram, I'm Real Matt Sager. And on Facebook, I'm The Matt Sager. I've got my voiceover page there as well. It's Matt Sager VO. And this podcast's page is Matt Sager Podcast. And for the rest, more social media links, archived episodes of this podcast, my voiceover reels and contact info, blog posts, articles, much more. You can find all that at mattsagervoiceover.com.